My name is Helma Lutz, and I'm the director of the Cornelia Goethe Center at Goethe University Frankfurt. I have the honor and the immense pleasure to introduce to you today our distinguished speaker, Anne Phoenix. Anne, she will give a lecture entitled Interrogating Intersectionality Contestations, Should the Privileged Speak? Before I introduce Anne, I will say a couple of words about our lecture series. The lecture series is called Intersectionality in a Crossfire ? Intersectionality is a concept that focuses on the intersection, intertwining of interactions of different forms of inequality, different relations of inequality. This approach was developed in order to make visible the entanglement of social categories such as race, class, and gender. According to the criticism of Black social scientists, discrimination becomes invisible at their intersection. The legal expert Kimberly Crenshaw demonstrated this with the paradigmatic case of discrimination that was endured by Black women workers in the US when their employer, General Motors, dismissed them as Black women, and they were not able to sue General Motors because there was no category for them. From the US intersectionality, the concept that Kimberly Crenshaw came up with found its way across oceans, and it became a traveling concept. For several decades now, the concept has been vividly discussed in global feminist, scientific, and political debates. Intersectionality has inspired and has become part of the anti-racist movement and anti-discrimination policies. On its basis, strategies for action and new methodologies in gender studies emerged. In my view, and in that of the co-organizers of this lecture series, Bettina Kleiner and Marianne Schmidbauer, scientific analysis in the field of social justice should be based on an intersectional approach. In Germany, especially, the interventions of Black, Jewish, migrant, and lesbian women have linked up with international debates and thus created important impulses for intersectionality debates. The analysis developed in the international intersectionality debates rejects an engagement of feminist politics and research in which gender functions as a master category. Instead, its focus is on the historically specific social disadvantage factors or discrimination categories like sexuality, social class, race, ethnicity, disability, belonging. This implies a heightened sensitivity for a reconsideration of the previous subject of feminism, which has to be abandoned because it produces ethnocentric, colonial, and imperial or imperialist exclusions. In this lecture series, many questions will be discussed, like who can work with the concept of intersectionality? Does the concept represent a theory, a heuristic tool, or a methodology? Who owns the concept, and how is the concept used today in social and educational sciences and law? And can or should Black feminists claim the concept for themselves in a different way than white feminists do because of its origin in Black women's epistemology? So far for the lecture series, which the main part of the lectures had to be postponed to the next semester. Really the fantastic event we have here today is that Anne Phoenix has agreed to give her lecture in a digital version, so everybody can follow it. Anne Phoenix is a trained psychologist, and she is a professor at University College London. Her work can be located in the realm of social psychology. So the social and the psychological is her subject. She is an incredible productive researcher and has published more than 100 articles and at least, I could not really find all of them together, at least 20 books plus many special issues. The range of her themes is very wide, to mention only a few. Anne has written about young mothers, about young masculinities, about young migrant women in secondary education, about non-normative childhoods, and about childhood in everyday family lives. Also about identities and racisms, about the meaning of race and racism in the lives of young people from mixed parentage background. She is not only a brilliant researcher, but also a public intellectual. She received many distinctions and prizes. She was a guest professor in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway, in Finland, to name just a few. And she was also appointed as a member of the British Academy. And most of the time, she was the first Black woman in her field. And she is one of the most distinguished scholars of intersectionality studies. Anne and I have known each other since the early 1990s when we became friends. Together with Neera Yuval Davis, we edited the book Crossfires, Nationalism, Racism, and Gender in Europe, which was published in the late 1990s. We have talked at each other's conferences, and we are still colleagues on the editorial board of the European Journal of Women's Studies. And we are very sorry that Corona has forced us to postpone your coming to Goethe University as the fourth Angela Davis guest professor. But it's only postponed. You will come next year when hopefully Corona is behind us somehow in the summer of 2020. And as I said, we are extremely happy that you have agreed to give this digital lecture to which we are looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helma, for such a generous introduction. And thank you as well as a member of the organizing committee for inviting me. I'm really pleased that the digital has made it possible for me to be with you all today. I'm sorry, of course, that I'm not able to be there in person, but it seems to me that actually COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter and hashtag Say Her Name have actually highlighted the ways in which intersectionality matters. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to now share my screen and start by talking about my title, Interrogating Intersectional Contestations, Should the Privileged Speak? And I mentioned already COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter and hashtag Say Her Name, which serves to remind us that there are also women and girls who are Black women and girls who are killed by the police in the USA and elsewhere as well. And why I think that they help us to think more about intersectionality is that they illuminate the processes that lead to differential morbidity rates by, for example, ethnicity, nation, migration status, social class, age, gender, place, and space. All of those have been shown to have an impact on morbidity rates and illness rates in general with COVID-19. And they also have an impact on the ways in which Black lives matter. They also have helped us to illuminate, particularly Black Lives Matter and #SayHerName, the socio-historical processes that lead to the devaluing of Black lives. It seems to me that one of the things that Black Lives Matter has helped to contribute, so that the sadness of George Floyd's murder has really helped to illuminate, is that there are psychosocial injuries that accrue from everyday racisms and that are historically located. They have been there at the back of people's experiences, Black and white, and other ethnic groups for centuries. It's intersectional. It's important that we think of it in that way. But also, in thinking particularly about Black Lives Matter, but also about COVID-19, we see that there are collaborative alliances that have come together to demonstrate and also to work for change in new ways. One of the things that is striking is that many people now want to read, to think, to understand the social context in which they live and to talk about them in new ways. But not only talk, but listen too. So to think about intersectionality, which I've said has really been illuminated by this new conjuncture. In Empirical Intersectionality, A Tale of Two Approaches, Marie Hancock talks about the way in which intersectionality theory has been characterized as the most significant intellectual contribution of gender studies to the world. That's a big claim. And I think that it's really important that we understand why that's so. So in the annual review of sociology, Patricia Hill Collins, who's one of the central theorists of intersectionality, talks about the way in which it references the critical insight that race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age operate not as unitary, mutually exclusive entities, but rather as reciprocally constructing phenomena. And that's important. Helma's already explained what intersectionality is, but this is another way of thinking about key themes in intersectionality, that all these things are not mutually exclusive, but that they reciprocally construct each other. That means that gender and ethnicity, for example, decenter each other. You cannot add them together. So, as Hill Collins says, intersectionality as a knowledge project, it's epistemological, and its raison d'etre lies in its attentiveness to power relations and social inequalities. And those things are crucially important. Power relations and social inequalities, because any social category to which people belong is relational with people positioned differently in that social category. And so there are social inequalities and power relations. And Helma has already mentioned Kimberlé Crenshaw and the way in which in her work, she coined the term and also was concerned with simultaneous positioning, that we didn't think about categories as additive and essentialist, but thought about them as simultaneous and what that meant, for example, for Black women in legal processes. And yet, having said how important it is, intersectionality is increasingly debated and contested, and it's debated and contested by outsiders and insiders. And outsiders, I mean people who wouldn't dream of using intersectionality, who hate it, and insiders, those who are using it very much. So what I want to argue in this talk is that concerns about the theoretical ownership of intersectionality have come about because of fears about the silencing of racialization, the silencing of racisms, and also concerns that intersections with gender are not being properly addressed. But they serve to illuminate social processes in themselves. Those debates, those concerns, help us to see what the social processes that are being invoked, that are being worried about, are, as well as the hopes and fears that theorists have, and those hopes and fears about transformation towards social justice. And there are some who hope for that transformation and some who fear it. So the contemporary pandemic of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter have shifted our understandings of how much racialization is central to social context and how we can understand social context. And as I started by saying, we now understand so much more that it's not that COVID-19 or Black Lives Matter caused social inequalities or caused racialization to be important, but that we see how important those things have always been implicitly when there is something like a pandemic, when we really come to talk about how it is that Black lives matter. But also, I want to argue that contestations and alliances across constructed boundaries to do with any of these social categories are crucial. Contestations are important. Difficult conversations are important, and silences are important to stop, so that we should not remain silent on these issues. We should contest, we should talk, and we should have alliances that are sometimes uncomfortable. To think about the German case, many of you will be familiar with the attacks against women, for example, on New Year's Eve in Cologne, 2015 to 2016, that new year. And Sabine Haak and Judith Butler, writing about it, say that these attacks obviously had to be denounced in unequivocal terms, but they provided an opportunity to mobilize concepts such as gender, sexuality, and a certain notion of women's emancipation to justify racist or anti-Muslim policies of exclusion. So the question becomes how to provide a framework in which both racism and violence against women can be co-articulated, or how to conduct a non-racist, anti-sexist discourse that's also a non-sexist, anti-racist discourse. And they argue that many people did not do this. For example, they use the magazine Emma as an example of how racism and racialization was invoked and really augmented rather than thought through in complex ways in response to those attacks. So what I want to do in this talk is first to think a bit about the opposition to intersectional thinking, and then to move on to look at productive contestations within intersectional feminisms, something that I think that we have continually to look at, and then think about what is important for continuing conversations towards social justice. So first of all then, to think about the contestations. And here, the heading is White Conservative Resistance to Intersectionality, but I'm not directly here citing white conservative resistance, but Jane Coaston. In my conversations with right-wing critics of intersectionality, I found that what upsets them isn't the theory itself. Indeed, they largely agree that it accurately describes the way people from different backgrounds encounter the world. The lived experiences and experiences of discrimination of a Black woman will be different from those of a white woman or a Black man, for example. So it's not that they're objecting to. But she says they object to its implications, uses, and most importantly, its consequences, what some conservatives view as the upending of racial and cultural hierarchies to create a new one. So in other words, they fear that they will be put at the bottom of a hierarchy where they've been at the top. But as Jane Coaston continues, but Crenshaw isn't seeking to build a racial hierarchy with black women at the top. Through her work, she's attempting to demolish racial hierarchies altogether. And I think that's very important. But there is that reason for a backlash against intersectionality. There are also claims that intersectionality silences. So here to quote Tyler Watkins, so if a privileged person speaks on a topic that is unapproved based on their group memberships, their opinion is not just worthless, it is likely offensive. According to intersectionality, it is best that privileged people refrain from speaking at all. And that the bold there is not mine, it's Tyler Watkins. And one of the things I'm arguing is that privileged people have to speak. So it isn't best that they refrain from speaking at all. And certainly it isn't the case that they're being stopped from speaking by most of those who are intersectional thinkers at all. But you can see what the issue here is for some people who are against intersectionality. And here from within a feminist account, one that I very much like because it was so dramatic, is Julie Burchill, who's, she's a feminist thinker and journalist, who says, don't you dare tell me to check my privilege. And she says intersectionality may well sound like some unfortunate bowel complaint, but in reality, it seeks to make a manifesto out of the nastiest bit of Mean Girls, wherein non-white feminists, especially, are encouraged to bypass the obvious task of tackling the patriarchy's power in favor of bitching about white women's perceived privilege in terms of hair texture and body shape. So she's very much trivializing what she sees as Black women's critique of white feminists from an intersectionality perspective. So that's another way in which many people who've critiqued intersectionality have done so, about checking privilege, refusing to think about white privilege. So that's briefly some of the ways in which there's been opposition. I want to think about productive contestations from within intersectional feminisms next. But before I do, I want to point out, of course, what those people from within the academy, those of us who are within the academy, know is always the case, that popular theories are always reworked. And I was amused by this, not amused by the work itself, but by the fact that, you know, after Foucault, if you look up, has been cited well over 1 million times, that here is somebody, Eric Parras, who in 2006, his book was heralded with a dramatically new interpretation of the development of the thought of Michel Foucault, one of the 20th century's most influential thinkers. In this lucid and groundbreaking work, Eric Parras reveals that our understanding of the philosophy of Michel Foucault must be radically revised. He's the first to show a transformation that not only placed Foucault in opposition to the archaeological and genealogical positions for which he is renowned, but aligned him with some of his fiercest antagonists. And now I'm not saying that Eric Parras does not do this or that the work is not important. It's not a work I know, but simply to point out that what Barbara Tomlinson called, highlighted as the rhetorics of rejection and replacement are central to the academy. She didn't coin these terms, but actually she's using them in thinking about intersectionality. But they are part of what the academy is about. We're all encouraged to say the ways in which our work is particularly groundbreaking, and therefore the ways in which other people's work has somehow failed previously. This is not something new. Popular theories are always reworked, and intersectionality is currently one of the most popular. Well, I think Cathy Davis, in a paper this year, 2020, in the European Journal of Women's Studies sums up very well the heart of contestation from within intersectionality. So I'm going to read the quote from her abstract. She says, feminist scholars have increasingly expressed their worries about the depoliticization of intersectionality since it has traveled from its point of origin in US Black feminist theory to the shores of Europe. They've argued that the subject for which the theory was intended has been displaced, that Black feminists have been excluded from the discussion, and that white European feminists have usurped all the credit for intersectionality as theory. Intersectionality has been transformed into a product of the neoliberal academy rather than the helpmeet for social justice it was meant to be. And I think that does get to the heart of some of the concerns, and that those concerns are, to some extent, well-founded in that there is good reason to be concerned that intersectionality might lose its critical edge, might not be used to think about social justice. But one of the things about that contestation is that it has to take into account that theories are always taken up and changed by people who use it, and that in itself is important. But some of the reason for suspicion, I think, comes from, for example, approaches that suggest that US Black scholars take, for example, systemic rather than constructionist approaches, and so really essentializes a whole group of scholars and pits them against another group who are also essentialized, but in a way that makes them seem as if they are really forward-thinking rather than structurally bound. So I think sometimes the terms of the debate can be problematic in itself. There are also concerns, of course, about racialization being omitted from intersectional analyses when Kimberlé Crenshaw started off from that approach. And that was why she coined the term, even though she would be the first to admit that she was not the first person to be concerned with intersectional issues, that even though the term had not been coined, people were attempting to do this work as well. So, as Gail Lewis says, one of the concerns is a theory designed to promote social justice for Black women is used to erase their concerns and marginalize them. And I've mentioned Barbara Tomlinson already, saying how important the scene of argument is, that how it is that the argument is set out creates a rhetorics of rejection and replacement that are problematic when it comes to replacing Black women's thinking. And Sioma Bilgay, who's been vociferous about the issue of whitening intersectionality, argues that knowledge capitalism under neoliberalism does not exclude or obliterate differences, but operates through them while neutralizing them. And while she says this is not about the race of practitioners, she is very much concerned about the erasure of race in various theories in intersectionality and the way in which it's been picked up, and argues that this disciplining, diluting and whitening something that was initially insurgent and counter-hegemonic is problematic in its epistemological claims and its epistemological and social justice effects. So that's the complaints. Those are, it seems to me, issues that are important to listen to be concerned about, to think about, particularly in a context where now we realize just how pervasive and how important it is to think about how racialization and racisms impact on the very lives and life chances, the morbidity of Black people. Well, some scholars have decided that what they'll do in response to such concerns is to take separatist, insider visions for themselves. So Rennie Edo Lodge, for example, published in 2017 this book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. She's a Black British journalist and author. And what is perhaps ironic is that this has been the best-selling non-fiction book in the United Kingdom for a long time, so that many people are reading it and thinking about it. And of course, in publishing the book, what she's doing is talking to white people about race, because the argument she's making, many Black people are familiar with already. So it's ironic that she is actually speaking to white people about race. Not to take away from taking seriously the fact that a young Black woman should feel that it's not worth talking any longer to white people about race, that it gets her nowhere. One would hope that in 2020, with COVID-19 and its ramifications and Black Lives Matter, that is changing, but it's an important point that she's making. And then in Sweden, Gunilla Hultén points out that Rumet is a group that's emerged, and to quote, emerged from a survival instinct and say, we choose separatism. Otherwise, we will never get the anti-racist conversation going. Otherwise, our role is to develop other people's thinking, not ours. Otherwise, we will never be anything else than a token Black friend, an alibi, a quota-based Black island in an otherwise white ocean. And I think that the fact that they have made clear why it is that they feel that they need to take a separatist perspective is important. And of course, separatism is something that feminism knows well. Consciousness raising in the 1960s and 70s and 80s was very important for women meeting together to think through their own position and so on. And I think that it's really important to take such writings, such thoughts very seriously indeed. But I want to come on to thinking about continuing conversations across boundaries, because I think that separatism and separatism now is certainly not helpful. So one of the things that we need to think about is debates across boundaries. Neri Yuval Davis, who moved from having published an enormous amount on gender, moved to really thinking about intersectionality quite a long time ago. And in her 2011 book, Bordering, she says intersectional analysis should not be limited only to those on the multiple margins of society, but rather that the boundaries of intersectional analysis should encompass all members of society. And thus intersectionality should be seen as the right theoretical framework for analysing social stratification. And Kathy Davis, from the same paper that I've mentioned already, says, as a travelling theory par excellence, intersectionality demands that we all think transnationally and find ways to have heated and critical debates in which we are respectful of our differences and find ways to learn from them. And I think that that is crucially important. And that means equally that white feminists who are intersectional scholars understand where it is that Black feminists who give a separatist critique or a criticism that they don't see themselves within, where they're coming from and why it is, so that the heated debates are heated, they are critical, they are engaged, and that it doesn't exclude anyone from doing intersectional research. So that's really important. And Devon Cabado, who's a Black critical race theorist, talks about the framing of intersectionality as being only about women of colour as being problematic, because it leaves colour-blind intersectionality and gender-blind intersectionality unnamed and uninterrogated, further naturalising white male heterosexuality as the normative baseline against which the rest of us are intersectionally differentiated. And Cabado and Harris, in a 2019 chapter, talk about the importance of the social justice imaginary, the importance of freedom dreams that are pluralistic, that include in everybody in a way that interrogates and names rather than excludes. And I want to go back to Peggy McIntosh's original notion of white privilege, because it's this paper that's led to what various people have been critiquing, angry about, when they say that they don't want to check their privilege. So in 1988, Peggy McIntosh had various disagreements with Black women. And what she did was, having got over being angry, was to think for some time about the ways in which she did have white privilege. Every time she thought of something, she wrote it down, and I think came up eventually with 40 odd ways in which, when she thought about it, she had unearned privilege, that she had to really think about seeing racism differently. And she concluded that as a white woman, she was privileged in many ways. So what she was doing was checking her own privilege rather than saying, you check your privilege, although she advocates that people do think about the ways in which they're privileged. And of course, with intersectional perspectives, we think about privilege in complex ways as intersecting, not just to do with racialization, but at this moment, it is even more starkly apparent the way in which racialization and racisms produces privilege and disprivilege, both at one and the same time. They're relational, and power is in itself relational. And other people have thought about privilege as well. Paula Rothenberg's memoir, Invisible Privilege, is really helpful in her thinking through the ways in which, as a white, affluent Jewish woman, she could see some aspects of privilege very well. She could see that there was anti-Semitism, which disprivileged her. She could see that her brother was more privileged than herself, but she found it much, much harder to see the ways in which, as a white middle-class woman, she was herself very privileged in some ways. And she writes about that, I think, really very, very clearly. And other people who've really thought through privilege come to understand it. So Gaby Hinchliffe, who's a young white woman who says that she's restricted in some ways and privileged in others, says, check your privilege used to annoy me. Now I get it. And Paris Lees, a white transgender activist, argues that it's not a case of liking intersectionality, but of accepting that some people have more to struggle against than you. And of course, again, this is intersectional and complicated. And the Black feminist scholar, Jennifer Nash, in her latest book and in some of her papers, argues that we have to reimagine Black feminism. Not that we think that Black feminists don't experience racism and that racism does not matter and needs to be thought about theoretically, opposed, and so on. But as she says, my work intervenes in this conversation, and she means the conversation, the heated conversation about intersectionality and ownership of it, by treating defensiveness as the Black feminist affect that attaches to the popularization and circulation of intersectionality. I understand defensiveness to be a space marked by feelings of ownership and territoriality, and by loss and grief. The book then theorizes defensiveness as the feeling that emerges when intersectionality is thought to be a lost object, or worse, a stolen object. It is also a book that seeks to encourage and imagine other ways of feeling Black feminist, other ways of being Black feminist, and doing Black feminist labor in the academy that eschew defensiveness and its toxicity. So what she's doing is opposing the reductive, identitarian version of intersectionality that's common in universities. And here, Carla Rice, Elizabeth Harrison, and Mae Friedman talk about, what it means to do social justice and do justice to intersectionality in research. And this paper came out of reviewing applications for research funding and really finding that what people were putting in their research projects, well, to quote, Rice was dismayed to find an increasing move towards use of the term intersectionality without any meaningful engagement with debates in the field or substantiation from the term's critical focus. So there were very simplistic additive approaches often coming up. And so I think that this points to the importance of really letting anybody who wants to do intersectionality do it, but not in a simplistic way, not saying you can only do it in this way, or it only belongs with these people, but rather that it has to be done well, and it has to be done in a way that fits with the theorization of intersectionality. So they say, thus, in our view, the animating consideration for critical researchers in undertaking intersectional research is one of continuously and unequivocally interrogating at every stage of the process, am I doing justice? So that the social justice element is important. And again, back to Sabine Hark and Judith Butler in their 2018 chapter, and they say it is one of the most pressing tasks of our world at present to find opportunities to live with others and share the world without wiping out the otherness of others, but also without denying the undoubtedly persisting quandaries that have and will emerge along the way. Precisely for this reason, we have no choice but to provincialize our own position and explore possibilities of solidarity across difference. And I think that's the key thing I want to bear in mind, that we have to have solidarity across difference without refusing to accept difference, without universalizing our own experiences, without refusing to understand the experiences of others, or that other people are othered, but that we have to think about how we can have solidarity across difference. And here in a 2018 special issue of the feminist journal Hypatia, Park and Hare say the next 3 articles in this special issue deal with contested feminist discourses and practices situated at intersections of gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. Behind the relatively smooth facade of the distributed, finished product are a series of decisions and disagreements, both small and large. And they talk more about that I've cut out. The we here is aspirational. Throughout this process, we have aspired to collaborate toward the common goal of creating a space within feminist philosophy for women of color and third world women to speak about the contested terrains that we inherit, inhabit, and seek to reshape. So contestation being at the heart of attempting to shift thinking in particular disciplines. But also, one can ask the question about creating a space for others to speak, and the debates that there have been about, for example, giving voice, and that one cannot do that because giving voice always carries within it power relations that mean that they are silencing in much the way that Spivak talks about, Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak talks about the subaltern not being able to speak. So complicated, but nonetheless, I think a really important recognition that we is aspirational. We have to work at being we, at allying across constructed boundaries all the time. And that's important to do. It's worth it, but it's work, it's hard, and we don't necessarily get it right, and we think about it over time. And to cite Helma Lutz's paper, Intersectionality as Method, where she says debates about intersectionality and social inequalities can no longer reduce the analysis of gender, class, and race to oppression and discrimination, but need to consider the privileged positionings within and between them, a position that's deeply contested, as many intersectionality scholars implicitly and explicitly cherish a master category of oppression. Intersectionality as a method can avoid this trap. And I think that that's important, but again, it speaks to the difficulty of this. It's not easy. And I think we're at a point in thinking about intersectionality where we do have to contest, have difficult conversations, and think about how we can do this. And having said all that, I want to make the point that, of course, it matters how speaking is done. Speaking is not in itself enough. And I want to illustrate this through a study that looked at science classrooms, a study by Louise Archer and many colleagues. And to quote them, they say, a dominant performance was identified across the classrooms of talking science through muscular intellect. Such performances were experienced ambiguously by teachers and were viewed negatively by other students, notably girls and quiet boys, due to silencing their contributions and limiting the range of ways that others might be recognized as intelligible science students. So that's Can the Subaltern Speak Science? And intersectional analysis. So I want to come back to the argument of my talk and to say what I've been talking about is the ways in which fears about the silencing of racialization, racisms, and intersections with gender have produced some of the heated debate, some of the refusal to talk to each other, some of the pain and hurt, some of the umbrage that is currently part of intersectional work from within intersectionality. I'm not so much concerned with from those outside intersectionality. But intersectionality is crucial. It's crucial at this moment for helping us to understand the pandemic that means that we are online rather than meeting face to face, and so makes it all the more important that we engage with each other in meaningful ways, but also for understanding that racisms and racialization are central to the things that we often leave unexamined as social context. And I hope that one of the things that these horrible things have done, the killing of George Floyd and the contemporary pandemic, is helped to disrupt what Gloria Wecker calls white innocence. So that I'm advocating for contestations and alliances across constructed boundaries and how crucial those are. And I want to end by some conversation that Paul Gilroy and Ruth Wilson Gilmore have had just a few weeks ago, and that's on the website of UCL, the Sarah Parker Raymond Center that Paul Gilroy is now heading. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a scholar that some people will know, a very eminent scholar, says, a path that worries me very much, which is one that is in the recapitulating a certain kind of apartheid thinking in the name of undoing the effects of apartheid in the world scale. The tendency that's got me worried is the one in which people are insisting that only certain demographics of people are authorized to speak about, speak from, or speak against. Certain kinds of horrors and other people have already existing assignable jobs based on their demographic. So in other words, she's worried that there's a certain kind of apartheid being recapitulated. And she goes on, so white people are supposed to fix white supremacy and so on and so forth. That path, which is actually a pretty strong path, doesn't excite me. I'm 70 years old. I'm done with it. The path, however, which some of the young Black Lives Matter people named 5 years ago in that year of uprising in the United States after the death of Mike Brown and Freddie Gray and so forth, the one in which they said quite simply, when Black Lives Matter, everybody lives better. That's the path that is of interest to me. So I, for one, would like very much, I endorse completely reinvigorating the notion of universal. And as a Black public intellectual and scholar who, as she says, is 70 years old, I think that's pretty powerful. And that is what I would also like to advocate, that we think about the fact that when Black lives matter, everybody lives better. When women's lives matter, everybody lives better. And we have to think about the intersection of lives along many intersecting categories and what that means. We can only do that through speaking about it. So should the privileged speak? Yes, but it matters how they speak, and it matters that they take time and trouble to speak with people with whom they may feel that they are in contestation, and that they speak with people who might well feel that they're attempting to disrupt some of the gains that have been forged through theorizing racialization and racisms. And I think that if we could all do this, that the complexity that intersectionality betokens would help us all in this period, and very much, as Jill Bradbury says in her latest book, really help us to be good ancestors for the future, to build good ancestry for ourselves, for the legacy that we leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. This was brilliant. And it is such a lot of food for thought about that. I think it is really hard to pick out one of the points you made and ask a question about it. But one thing I would like to pick up again, because it is quite challenging in the end when you quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who says, okay, I'm really done with some of these struggles that are going on at the moment, and I would like to reinvigorate the notion of the universal. And I think that's a challenge for feminism, for gender studies, because criticizing the position of the white privileged male generated knowledge, that was one of the critical ideas of feminism in the beginning, to say, okay, we don't need the universal. We have to look at the partial and as a different positions. So it's this, I think, is very thought-provoking when she comes up with this notion of the universal. And when I think about it, it may, and I think she probably is talking about a different kind of universal than the universal we have been criticizing and trying to challenge within the gender studies, and also within racism studies and so forth. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I can't speak for Ruth Wilson Gilmore, but you know what I think that what she's speaking against is the notion that then what you do is say only certain people can speak. You know, I know what it is, for example, to be Black, and I know what that means. White people cannot speak about the oppressions or, you know, or contribute to anything. So not that you cannot critique and criticize and pick up, because she does. She's certainly able to critique very well the ways in which, for example, white masculinities might be used to perpetuate various privileges and so on, but that one doesn't speak that says, okay, therefore, one one is so local, so specific, that only certain people embodied in particular ways are able to speak. So that's really important. And I think that the other part of it is that the universal that we have spent a lot of time critiquing has been a universal that takes an exclusionary standard, a standard that treats the white male as implicitly normative. That the universal that Gloria Wecker is critiquing in White Innocence, very much so, that both treats itself as normative and also refuses to have any light shone on itself, you know, denies that it's doing so, denies that there's anything to be seen in focusing on it. So universal requires rendering everybody open to scrutiny, not keeping white innocence in play at all. And this has become even more and more apparent that it's important to eschew that notion of universalism, as we understand, for example, that in anything you can think of, whether it's in artificial intelligence and the digital, the ways in which the standard, implicit standard of the white male has served to do disservices to women, to Black people, and certainly Black women within it, and that we haven't even been able to understand. I mean, the example of the way in which, for example, Amazon devised a system for recruitment and making that easier, and then realized some way down the line that as a learning system, it couldn't really sort that out, and yet it had within it prejudices against women. Anybody who'd gone to a women's college in the United States was automatically thrown out, because the sorts of people who got jobs in Amazon didn't go to women's colleges, and so that was learned by the system, the artificial intelligence system, as a sexist feature that nobody picked up, because it's implicit, because there is white male innocence as well. So that's really important. Or the way in which we in Britain are currently dealing with a situation where women's health has been so dismissed as, oh, that's just women, that actually it's taken a very long time for now 3 procedures that women have been subjected to for a long time to be recognized as really problematic to their health. Because many women who've been calling for inquiries for many years pointed out that what they said was dismissed because it's just women complaining about various things and so on. And also black women's health, not certain things not being investigated enough, so that we don't know why it is for sure that you know, all the panoply of factors that come together to make COVID-19 more lethal for some others. You know, there's an intersection of factors, but we don't know all the health ones even. So I think the universal needs to be critiqued from that perspective, and it's a different universal that we need to aspire to.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is exactly what we need to think through, because this is a different kind of universal. And just one other question. You have talked at length, and I think very well based on many of the people who have talked about it, about the role of white privilege. And I was just wondering what you, when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment, what you would say is happening there. So what I've seen in demonstrations is that there are white people marching in the Black Lives Matter movement, and that they don't just march with their friends, but they also carry signs saying, I'm privileged as a white person. So in some way, of course, as somebody who has been looking at these questions for a long time, I was really delighted to see that. But what would you say, I mean, is the, also students asked me that yesterday, so why is it, and why is the movement or the participants, the background of the participants in the movement is changing, and what would that mean for, well, understanding what is happening with young people at the moment?
The first thing I would say is that there always have been white people who joined in any movement, I mean, sort of against racism and so on, but obviously not in the numbers, and not as vociferously as we've seen in the current Black Lives Matter demonstrations and so on. And I think that that's really, really hopeful. But what I think is also very hopeful is that there has been a real hunger on everybody's part, it seems to me, involved in there, to learn, to understand the history of how we got to where we are, to understand what it means, to hear from Black people about what it means, what everyday racisms look like, what are the microaggressions, and that the media has not immediately trivialized notions of microaggressions, but has also been putting on, we've had lots of programs in Britain which looked at the history of enslavement and looks at the ways in which British society is built so much on the money. You know, the Industrial Revolution was fueled by money from enslavement. So many grand houses and so on in Britain are paid for. Investment in the arts, investment in all sorts of things came through enslavement. Having insurance came through enslavement and so on. So rather than trivializing, the media, not all the media, but the serious media, has actually also looked at what's going on, and many occupations have had to say, yes, we have been racist or perpetuated or used money from enslavement, and we really have to think differently and think about, you know, employing more people from, you know, the range of people there are in society and so on. So that is different. But I think that there's also backlash, of course, with some people saying, you know, this is nonsense and so on. And for example, one historian who always prides himself in being outspoken, saying outrageous things about Black people and so on, has just apologized because he's been sacked from various places. He's had honors removed. He's not being asked back on the media and so on, because he said, well, clearly slavery was not genocide, because otherwise there won't be so many damn Black people in Britain, in Africa and so on. so, there are people who don't go along with what's happening with Black Lives Matter. But it seems to me if the young people in particular who are wanting to learn, who are wanting to support, who are coming to understand what racism means, what it's been like, what privilege looks like. And actually, I don't like saying that it's about privilege, because I think that much that's put under the notion, under the category of privilege, should be everyday. It shouldn't be that Black mothers and Black young men should have to be wary every time they go out in case somebody hates them enough to kill them, or the police is going to stop them because they're driving a car. That's not a privilege to be able to walk about your everyday world or to drive. And, so some of the things I think should not be seen as privilege, but at the moment I can't think of a better way to express it. But it should be that these are every day for everybody. But I think the understanding of those things is really important. I faintly worry that it's rather like the 1970s and 80s racism awareness training, where again, Black people bare their souls for white people to learn from. And that is very unsatisfactory because it sort of stirs up anger, pain, all those sorts of things. And it is not worth it if there isn't going to be real change in society. But what I'm hopeful about is that somehow there has been what many people call a tipping point. Again, very strange terminology, but that we're at a point where things will really change. And I think that it's the coming together of COVID-19 and of Black Lives Matter, all those things that became apparent through COVID and through Black Lives Matter, together with the fact that the digitalization of life means that so many things are visible, like, for example, the white woman who, when asked by a Black bird watcher, a Black guy bird watcher, to put her dog on a lead in Central Park, where dogs have to be on a lead, first of all said, "Don't film me." And when he did, phoned the police to say, "Oh, there's a Black man who's going to attack me," knowing full well that that could cost him his life. That is, being able to see things like that really brings home how microaggressions are not just microaggressions actually, but can so easily lead to the loss of life and the dangers that are posed every day for some people going about their lives in very polite, ordinary ways. So, I hope that things might really change. I hope that there's enough there to make for change. And if so, 2020 will be a year that we'll remember for both good and bad reasons. We'll remember all the people who have died untimely deaths in awful ways, including George Floyd, but all those thousands who've 500,000 who've died from COVID so far. But we'll also remember perhaps a real sea change in racisms, racializations, and perhaps in understanding intersectionality and how to talk across intersectional differences.
Thank you very much, Anne. Absolutely forward-looking, and I think, yes, we will continue this conversation next year when you're here, and then we can look back at whether this was a sea change and whether things have been moving, and there's a lot of things moving here in Germany as well. So really, for the first time, the colonial past becomes an issue in many on television, on the radio, and the questions like roads must fall. So about the name giving of German generals in the colonial wars of streets and so forth. So yes, there is a lot of hopeful signs in that sense, and of course the influence of the pandemic on all of this, I think we will analyze next year when you're here in Frankfurt. And thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helma.